All right, so welcome officially, everybody. I am Mari Jones. We are very excited to talk to you today about our 2020 vintage. It has been an interesting year, to say the least. Lots of challenges, lots of opportunities for great wine, though, to be made. So I'd like to introduce you to David Lattin, our winemaker, Kirk Lokka, our vineyard manager. We've been working together now for, this will be our fourth vintage, the three of us, although Kirk has been working with Emeritus since we started 21 years ago, and with my father, Bryce Jones, for longer than that. And Dave has had quite the career making wine all over California, or all over Napa and Sonoma, as well as some time in France. So we've got quite the team here. Just to reorient everybody, since we haven't done one of these in a while and we have some new people joining us, we're right in the Russian River Valley. You can see that dot for Hallberg Ranch right there on the border of Green Valley and the larger Russian River Valley AVA. And we have our second vineyard, Pinot Hill, that's just at the southern tip of Russian River Valley. Also, both of the vineyards are part of the Sonoma Coast AVA as well. It is a cool climate area. The coolest area is the Sebastopol Hills, which is Pinot Hill. The second coolest is Green Valley, which is where Hallberg Ranch is. Really, fog is what creates all these microclimates throughout, not just the county, but Russian River Valley. And we see fog intrusion that starts in the afternoons and then pushes inland overnight and then burns off during the day. So that's kind of our classic climate that we have here. So quick overview of 2020. Our vintage. So I think a lot of you know that there was an interesting year. So Dave, I'll actually turn it over to you just for a quick assessment, and then we'll get into some of the nitty gritty too, but I'll turn it over to you, Dave and Kirk, for this.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And, you know, as the 2020 was shaping up as a vintage, all of us, particularly us winemakers, were particularly excited about how the vintage was unfolding. Yields were roughly about 20% of average, 20% off of average. You know, so smaller crop tends to portend for more concentrated wines. And Kirk can talk about the growing season and how that affected clusters and flowering and whatnot. But as we were doing some of the preliminary sampling of the vineyard, we noticed right away that very, very early on, the flavors were coming on, super intense, very aromatic with tremendous acidity. So I still feel, and I did at that time, and I still feel now, that 2020 is a spectacular vintage in terms of wine quality. You know, obviously there's some other issues that pose some challenges for both harvest and just thinking about how to make wine, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But weather during the growing season and the way the fruit presented itself on the vine, the kind of natural meager set. I think we're below 3 ton to the acre here at Hallberg, and down at Pinot Hill, less than 2 ton to the acre. So again, everything pointed to a spectacular vintage, and I think in the barrel, we're seeing the results of that. So I'm very excited about it, but also an opportunity to learn lots of things in what nature and the anger of nature can throw at us. So more to learn from this for sure.
Yeah. And I will say, you know, our vineyard now, Hallberg Ranch, is over 20 years old. Our Pinot Hill vineyard is, 12. Yep. Thank you, Kirk. 12 years old. The team that we work with, not just the people that you're seeing here, but the team that Kirk works with in particular, 20 people out in the vineyard, you know, every day, 5 days a week, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. That experience is really key to work with some of the challenges that we have. So our vineyards are also dry farmed, which means that they perform a little bit differently than vineyards that are irrigated, especially in terms of ripening time. And we'll get into that too. But Kirk, do you have anything else that you want to add just as a overview of the vintage before we get into the specifics?
Well, it was the 4th driest year on record for this winter. We were under 20 inches of rain. I think we had only about 17. We had a frost in April that trimmed good part of, now a small portion of the vineyard, but some. It was a classic summer up through the middle of August. We were all excited about it. I always look at it from a quality standpoint. I don't look at it at quantity too much. When it's quantity, then I have to thin more. And this year we didn't have to thin very much at all. And that's more a separation of clusters as opposed to reducing crop load. But it was cool during bloom, so we had extended bloom, little uneven bloom, which can make the grapes a little more complex. And but we were all looking to this harvest to be a classic going back, and I've been doing this 40 years, and it would rank up there probably in the top 2 or 3 through the middle of August. But I'm not sure the crop was off 20%. It might have been off about 10% of what I think is average. We've become accustomed to pretty heavy crops. But this year, because of the drought, you had smaller, more intense berries. They started ripening a little earlier than we anticipated. But I think it's because of the drought and because the vines were responding to the drier soil and the like. So that's about all I have to say.
All right, well, we'll ask you some more questions. You gave a really good preview. So I think the elephant in the room, I mean, although today there's probably many elephants in the room, but is the smoke, the fires that have that burned in wine country this year. So to give everybody a little bit of a frame of reference, there was a severe weather instance with lightning in the middle of August that sparked wildfires actually all around California and the North Bay in particular, from Santa Cruz up through Mendocino. So there was a significant amount of smoke that was in the air. You may remember seeing pictures, or you experienced pictures of that orange sky. There definitely are vineyards that have smoke damage, and there are definitely vineyards that don't. I think the biggest thing to remember about smoke damage is that we still don't know all that much about it as an industry. We're still learning a lot, and certainly for us as Pinot people, we are definitely learning a lot, because Pinots picked earlier. August is usually not wildfire season for us. It usually isn't until October, so it's not something that we've had to contend with before with Emeritus and with a lot of our, Sonoma County wineries that are making Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. For us in particular, we were able to pick a significant amount of fruit before any smoke got onto the vineyard. But I think it's really important to remember that Sonoma County, California, Napa Valley, all of these areas they're so varied in terms of geography, in terms of climate, wind patterns, fog patterns, that you could have a vineyard that is completely, covered in smoke, and not very far away, half mile away even, you could have a vineyard that's completely clear. So it's really hard to say that, it's all one thing, that the smoke, created, a universal, damage. But it definitely did exist this year. There was smoke exposure to a lot of vineyards, including ours. But it's also a good reminder that this is really an industry problem. It's not a consumer problem. There will not be wines out there that are damaged, certainly not from us and not from anybody else that I know. And now I think we have a chance to experiment and understand what we get the chance to learn. Like I said, there's so much about smoke damage that isn't understood. And now we have an opportunity to try to understand what this means for our wines, how much, damage is actually damage, what does it feel like when you're tasting the wine, etc. So that's kind of my PSA on smoke exposure. Dave, you have anything to add?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, just, being in the middle of it here and watching how each day unfolded, there were days when there was ash falling from the sky, but you couldn't smell a thing. So if you're not smelling anything, there's nothing potentially going to go into the grapes. And then there are other days when you couldn't see anything and you would smell the smoke, but it would be fleeting, or it'd be only in the morning or only in the afternoon. So the amount of time and the intensity and even the type of smoke, depending on what vegetation is burning, can have a huge effect on what actually might go into the grapes. And I think another important thing to remember is most of these things that come from smoke are the same compounds that come from brand new barrels that are toasted. And so that's something that we can talk about a little bit later, but the amounts that we're talking about, the amounts that we are seeing in the grapes early on are way below any sort of threshold, and a tenth of what a new barrel might actually contribute to a finished wine. So just, I want everyone to remember that point, that these compounds, in most cases, people find desirable at very low levels.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's also, important to say that there's only so many things you can test for, especially early on. And the test results that we've had back so far really don't give us pause or reason for concern. Everything from our vineyards have been quite low, to the point that it most likely wouldn't even be detectable. Well, it hasn't even been, from sensory analysis. So more testing to be done, but we're extremely optimistic that we get to take all those great things that we just said about what a vintage 2020 is, and be able to make beautiful wines that really reflect that, and not that are, damaged from smoke. So with that, I don't see any questions yet. Feel free to ask. Happy to answer anything, but we'll just move on. So we're going to just kind of walk through the growing season and what we were seeing and what everything looked like. So Kirk already mentioned it was a dry winter, smaller berries. We had some spring frost. Dave, Kirk, you guys want to add anything more to what we were seeing winter and spring and how that shaped up?
It was really classic. And when I say classic, it was cool. People around here only remember what was most recent, but May was foggy and cold, and the bloom was held up, and it was slow and coming around, which is what I kind of like. I want it to be cool early on. I want those grapes to take a little time getting started. When it's extremely warm in the early part of the year, the clusters expand rapidly. They get longer and bigger, and you're more likely to have bigger berries and heavier clusters. And that's why I prefer the cool. The cooler it is, the shorter the rake is, which is the stem. And the berries tend to be smaller because they aren't being forced by heat to expand quickly. So you end up with smaller berries, a little bit of differentiation in the berry maturity within the cluster, and they tend to be smaller. So it was classic in the spring. Just loved it. David?
Yeah, I concur with that, Kirk. And one of the things that was particularly exciting about this year is, in some years you assess the crop load just by, counts and sort of the way the clusters look. And then you come back a week later and they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger throughout the whole growing season. We've had vintages here where, like 2018, for instance, where the clusters just kept getting bigger and bigger, almost to the point of when we started picking, which, can cause a little bit of, when you're anticipating a certain crop coming off a block and it comes in, 40 to 50% higher, that's, that can happen. And what happened in 2020 is the berries pretty much stopped growing right as they were turning colored, and they never got heavier, they never got bigger, and pretty much what we thought we were going to get is exactly what we got, and it made for spectacular wines. And just the way the flavors came on very, very early.
Yeah. So then we go into summer. I think this was definitely considered, like you said, a classic Sonoma vintage. I think overall we had a little bit less fog cover, but we still had very cool nights. So we got that diurnal shift that we love and that we're really used to, but with a little bit less fog. So just kind of interesting in terms of sun exposure.
Can I make a comment about that picture right there, Mari? That
please.
If you see the way those clusters are, see the different sizes of all the berries. There's big, there's small. We call them sort of either shot berries, the ones that don't have seeds, or they're just partially developed. And when you get, I think Kirk alluded to this earlier, when you have that kind of variation within a cluster, it's just an opportunity for incredible complexity in the finished wines. It can make sampling really difficult if you're trying to assess overall sugar or acid, unless you're picking the whole cluster off, which is what we do when we sample our vineyards. If you're going there and pulling off individual berries, there's so much variability there that it's almost impossible to get a good number. So actually, when we're sampling our vineyards, we're pulling whole clusters off, so you get the whole effect. But whenever I see clusters that look like that, I get very, very excited about making wine.
Yeah, and that definitely was common this vintage.
That was.
Yeah. As Kirk said too, there really wasn't much thinning needed. Just having the smaller berries, they, like Dave said, they didn't continue getting bigger and bigger. So it was really a little bit of thinning for quality. You know, and by that I mean clusters not overlapping. We don't want, you know, mildew problems and the like. Kirk, do you have anything else to add about summer? What that was like?
Well, you guys have covered it really well. It's like I say, I've been doing this for 40 years, and the nice part is when you have a year like 2020, I can look at those vines and tell you whether they're going to be really heavy, really light, or right on cue. And this year it was kind of a pleasure saying they were right on cue, and we wouldn't have to thin the living tar out of them like we have some years, or not have enough fruit and sweat it out for the rest of the year. So it was a really nice crop level this year.
Yeah, and just because I have a picture of it up of leafing, do you want to talk a little bit about your leafing program, Kirk?
Yeah. You know, what's really nice, Mari alluded to it earlier, I've got a crew with a lot of experience. I've got guys that have worked for me for over 30 years, and I've got, I think a half dozen guys that have worked here at Emeritus since the beginning. And the nice part is they know what I want the fruit to look like and how much sun exposure that they need. So we do a real specific job in the leafing. It's just not tearing every leaf off. We want to have winemakers call it dappled light. I call it a pain in the neck. But the guys will pull the leaves out of the interior, the ones that are touching the fruit directly, and leave the exterior leaves as shade. So as the sun moves, the fruit is shaded at parts of the day, and we only do it on the morning side. And that prevents the fruit from getting kind of pruny flavors. If they have too much sun exposure, you'll get pruny, unripe, overripe kind of flavors later on. The winemakers that I work with really appreciate the kind of leafing that we do. So without seeing the pictures, you should be able to see in there that, you know, half the clusters are in shade and half the clusters are in sunlight. And that switches as the sun moves farther to the west. So it's great having experience out there. You don't have to reteach each guy every day. They're a good bunch.
Absolutely. Best team in the business, no question. So then harvest came. We started picking even earlier than we usually do. So we started on August 20th, which was what, 4 days earlier than last year?
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave and Kirk to talk about what you were seeing during harvest.
Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead,
David,
Kirk. Yeah.
Going to, David. David alluded to it, that as well. Flavors came on earlier this year, and I think it was because of the small crop, droughty nature. I think they moved through the ripening segment of the season. They started earlier than usual. I think we had veraison earlier than I even expected. I didn't expect us to pick until the 1st of September in May because it was so cool. But because Mari had talked about not much fog, there was a lot more sunlight. So the vines were functioning full blast, but not over fast due to heat. It was just good growing conditions, and we had good color, and I was pleasantly surprised, I guess, picking early. It doesn't hurt our fruit at all. Dry farming is the greatest thing that we can do out here because the flavors develop early. So they don't need to hang a long time. They just need to hang as long as they need to reach the flavors we want. So I thought harvest started out really well. We picked a lot of our own fruit early on, and I think David thinks they're pretty good.
I do. I'm loving these wines. Early on in the season, even right around veraison, when you're walking through the vineyard and kind of assessing what the overall ripening is like, to see the canes turning dark, kind of a mocha brown, even at or just prior or just post veraison, means that the the wood is beginning to harden off on that cane, and which is also a trigger for when the seeds start to harden off. And when that can happen earlier, you end up with really mature tannin in a grape that's at lower sugar with higher acidity. And to me, that's like that's the trifecta there. If you can get really mature tannins that aren't going to be harsh and bitter, with good color in the skin, which we always have because of dry farming and the way the guys handle the leaves in the vineyard. And then because we're picking at night, there's a number of things that are happening there that Kirk can talk to as well, but huge advantages from an acid balance standpoint and the perception of acidity when you pick at night, not to mention just the condition of the fruit being so much better when it's cool. Kirk talked about those sort of raisiny or baked fruit flavors. When you pick at night, you're picking at the freshest part of the 24-hour cycle when it's cool, when the fruit is at its freshest in flavor, and that translates directly into the wine as it ferments. So I just want to take one step back too and talk about just the advantages of being 100% estate and also having 100% full-time vineyard crew. From a winemaking perspective, to have fruit that's right out your back door is an incredible gift and luxury as a winemaker. And then to have a crew that's basically been working with Kirk for all these years, that's doing the vineyard operations exactly when it needs to happen, as opposed to if you were using a contract farming company, you might make a request for something to happen in the vineyard, but it might take a little while for that to happen. So having sort of this just-in-time farming and certainly delivery of fruit is a huge advantage to my end of the process. So it's I'm grateful every day during harvest for that.
And to zoom out just a little bit from our own little slice of heaven, the early picking was, it seemed pretty universal around Sonoma County. And then, as many people know, we had another fire that broke out later into September. And for instance, 90% of the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in the county was picked by that time, which is not something that we've necessarily seen in all other vintages. And then there was a heat spike around Labor Day, and that really accelerated everybody to hurry up and pick what was still out there. And I think that's also part of the reason why, oh, sorry, my dog is anxious. But that's also part of the reason why we saw some of those numbers, 90% picked before the glass fire broke out in September. So that heat spike, I think, just really pushed everybody to the finish line. All right, Dave, over to you. Observations about the vintage that you've seen from the cellar. And I'll throw it out there. Basically,
go ahead.
I think all of our wines have now gone through malolactic.
They are. There's a few more stragglers, some of the later lots from Pinot Hill. So from the roughly, 110 tons that we brought in, we've made about 30 different lots of wine, varying from 4 barrels to 12 barrels per lot. That photo there, you can see this sort of an average size of the cluster. That's actually a kind of unusually uniform looking cluster. Most of them had much more variation in berry size, but that is about the average size. They fit generally right in the palm of your hand. There's me at the sorting table, but there was very little sorting that needed to be done. The fruit was incredibly uniformly colored up. You can look at that table there. There's not a single leaf on that table. A lot of sorting tables are set up to pull what's called MOG material other than grapes. And Kirk and his guys do such an amazing job that there is no MOG. Certain vintages, you might have some dehydration that you might want to pull out, some drier fruit or some little green berries. Sometimes the little wings or secondary clusters that come off of the main cluster can be a little bit green. Often we'll pull those off, but sometimes it's a 4-person job doing the sorting. This year it was 1 to 2 maximum, and some batches of fruit went by barely even being touched by us. That's how beautiful the fruit looked. The wines, as soon as they started to ferment, you might hear about some people having to do micro fermentations to test for any sort of potential smoke that they might be worried about in the fruit. And we were doing macro fermentations. We were doing 2-ton to 5-ton lots, and 201, they were incredibly aromatic, super fruity, very concentrated. We're not a real aggressive house in terms of how we ferment our wines. They're all native ferment. They're in open top fermentations. Since we're picked at night, they're very, very cool to start. So it's a very nice gradual ease into the fermentation process with just gentle punch downs once things really get rolling. On average, the grapes are macerating for about 2.5 weeks. That'd be the longest. The free run is kept entirely separate, and the press one goes to separate barrels. So both free run and press in the 2020 are really spectacular. I mean, these wines are great, and the different clones from the different blocks. I mean, we have 11 different clones at Hallberg. They're very expressive this year. They're clearly delineated in terms of each wine batch, with lots of personality. So, I can't wait to kind of assess these wines when they're done with Mallow and start putting sort of theoretical blends together in my head. But all in all, things are pointing to a really spectacular year for us.
Hey, David.
Yes, sir.
Pinot Hill, how did that come out?
Those wines are insanely dark. And, often when you look at a wine and it's black in color, you might think they're going to be, overwrought, overripe, too extracted. These wines are dark and yet really light on their feet. The acids are through the roof, so they're super energetic. And aromatically, they're incredibly perfumed, spicy, in some cases savory. They're really phenomenal wines. And again, when you're at less than 2 tons of the acre, you can expect that kind of intensity. But Pinot Hill is always a joy to taste because they're just so all over the map and how the different clones express themselves on that site.
Great.
I'm going to make a plug. Get your questions in if you have any. We are approaching the end of our scheduled content. So if there's anything that you're wondering that you want to hear from Dave or Kirk, or even me, I suppose, if you have something for me, please feel free to ask. The chat, the Q&A, both open. We would love to hear from you and what you're wondering about. I will also say, I'll zoom out a little bit. These are characteristics that we've heard from other winemakers throughout Sonoma County, that they're intense wines, smaller clusters, smaller berries, a little bit more intense. So I think that's going to be kind of the signature of the vintage. And obviously what we see at our site is maybe even a little bit heightened from that because of dry farming and some of the treatments that we do in the cellar. So yeah, the wines so far are fantastic. I can't wait to get them in a bottle and have them out to everybody. And then of course, here's our team, the whole crew that makes it all possible. We couldn't do it without any of them. So please, since no more questions are coming in, we'll wrap up, but please join us next month. We're going to do this again. We've got 3 more of these scheduled through February, and then we'll reassess and come out with a new calendar. But next month, we're going to be talking with winemakers who work with Hallberg Ranch, our vineyard, and we're going to have a great panel discussion with what makes the vineyard special, what are characteristics, what are winemaking decisions that people are making to highlight this, beautiful piece of land that we have. So I hope that you'll all join us, invite your friends, invite your family. I will not invite my dog again. I apologize for her ill behavior. But we appreciate you joining us, and I hope that everybody has a great day. You can go back to watching your news now, and we will catch up with you next month. And if you have any questions, I think all of you know how to contact us. You can always reply to that Zoom email that comes. So thank you again for joining us. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next month.